Okay, so now in Photoshop I have my rendered image. You can see it's 36 inches wide. I'll worry about the height later. But I'm overall pretty happy with the rendering output from Rhino. I like the shadows that are being cast. I elected not to have the landform rendered as well because I know with the background image and all the other components that are going to be part of this composition are probably going to make it very difficult to see. So, um, and also because of the way the shadow is being cast, it's actually going to be cast on the um, back side of this, so I probably wouldn't even see it anyways. Like I said, I like the shadow settings. However, I still want to enhance this rendering a little bit more with some of the light settings. So what I like to do is use the Photoshop's Camera Raw filter. This is basically the rendering or the tool you use to edit camera raw photographs. It gives you the ability to enhance it pretty well. It combines a lot of the image adjustments that you can apply here. A lot of them kind of get combined in the camera raw filter. But before I even do that, I like to make sure that my layers are smart objects. And the reason for that is because if it's a smart object, then I'm going to use a non-destructive workflow in Photoshop. And what that means is that I'm not physically changing or uh, removing any of these actual pixels. I'm just kind of like it says, I'm just adjusting them, and it's never a permanent thing, which is nice because I can always go back and change settings without having to worry about um, losing the original. Um, I don't have to worry about if I save it and close out of it and not being able to get back to the original, because sometimes if you've made a lot of changes and you want to go back, you can just keep hitting Control Z until you get back, but obviously you lose that if you save and close it. If you get too far along, you lose it. So if you just right click on this and say convert to smart object, you'll see that there's this new icon over the thumbnail, which is going to prevent you from physically changing any of that or making it permanent. So even if I use the paintbrush here, it won't even let me brush over. Actually asks if I want to kind of convert it back to a rasterized image. So it's nice that it kind of prevents you from doing that. But if I go up to filter and go to camera raw filter, I got this new window that pops up, and there's a lot of settings that you can use to adjust your image, right? This is just the first tab. You have several of these tabs. You can start to really edit and refine your image. For those of you that this is the first time, you could probably get away with a lot of adjustments in this first tab. I honestly don't really go much further past the third. Sometimes, occasionally, I get into this other stuff, but for the most part, I don't even use all these settings. And again, just to kind of help you start off, if you just hit auto, it'll kind of gauge the image a little bit better and refine it. Obviously, you want to be able to control it and give it your own settings. So this is where I start to, again, kind of adjust these. So maybe I want the exposure to be a little bit brighter. I usually like to have some good contrast, so that always goes up a little bit. You'll see that you have highlights and shadows and whites and blacks. So for each one of these, I kind of like to push it more towards that spectrum. You can see that if you want to kind of gray out or dilute your highlights and shadows, you can start drawing it to the opposite side. I want them to still be pretty prominent. It's the highlights obviously can really start to get kind of washed out, so I'm not going to get too crazy with that one, but I definitely want the color to pop a little more. Same with the shadows. I want those to stay nice and rich and dark. And then I'll usually do the same thing with my whites and blacks too. Again, you have to be very careful with adding light because it can usually get washed out or seem too bright. And this, again, kind of adds that richness to it. Next, the texture, clarity, and dehaze. Again, this helps kind of take those materials that you've assigned and kind of enhance that texture. You can kind of see it in the metal where, let's see if I zoom in a little bit more. If I increase this texture, you can see that they start to read a little bit better. Same with the shadow and the decking. You can see what the difference it makes where that kind of gets really kind of weird versus that starts to really crispen those edges. Same with the clarity. That also kind of brings a little bit more of those details. And then the dehaze, there's not really any hazing going on in this. This works really good for photographs. You can see if you do it this way, it kind of really does the opposite. So you shouldn't have to really mess with that too much. And then a lot of times I like to reduce the vibrance too. So it's not too vibrant, but just nice and subtle. And it might not seem like a lot of changes were made, but it's always good to go down to here where you can swap the before and after so you can see like before, even though the settings again were pretty good, it's reading very dull. Now it's really got that kind of punch to it. If you want to, again, kind of go back to having more vibrance, you can see the difference a lot more, right? So this goes a long ways to just enhance your image a little bit more. Now you can hit OK now, and again, it'll take a second to apply that. But you'll see now that this is actually adding a smart filter, so I can always turn it on and off that way. Or as you add more changes to this, you'll see what that does. Like, so every time you make a adjustment to that layer, it adds that next component. And what's cool is and we'll get into this in more detail, if there's areas where it just seems like it's a little too much or maybe you don't want it to be as obvious, you can always mask some of that away. And I'll get into more detail later because it is a pretty important thing to know, and I don't want to kind of skim over it or have it competing with all this other information. So I kind of want to dedicate that to its own image. And again, what's great about it is you can continue to refine this. So you can go to adjustments, play with the curves, add a little more contrast to it, right? I mean, there's already quite a bit. So if you want a good contrast, you would create an S curve. Again, it's probably not going to be too obvious since I've already done quite a bit to it. Oops, we don't want to have too many of these points. Huh, I'm not sure why it didn't apply that. Let's see if it'll apply the levels. I'm not sure why it's not adjusting, but anyways, it's good to have these as smart objects. That way, anytime you apply these changes, they'll never be permanent. You can either turn them off, disable them, get rid of them, never having to worry about damaging the original image. So it's a pretty quick one, but it's a good way to just show how you can begin to enhance your rendering output from Rhino.